Comrades, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're back in the saddle for more Jammin' with Mammon, putting her there with McCarraher. CC Don is back in the driver's seat as we cross the threshold of the halfway point of McCarraher's epic tome to talk about populism, anarchism, socialism, the craft movement, the Commonwealth, the Covenant, theology, all that other good stuff. We have quite a long one today and a few announcements, so let's go ahead and get right down to business. One new project that yours truly, Chairman Bain, and the other Red Troika boys, CC Don and CC Alex, we have gone mobile and are now making our way into live streaming on the Red Library YouTube channel.
Time to go mobile.
If you haven't checked that out already, I will post some links down in the show notes, or you can just search for us on YouTube, and you should find us no problem there. We decided to make our foray into this weird and deeply enjoyable new medium by talking about some memes. What else would we do, right? We would talk about a meme, we would explain a meme, a Baudrillard meme of all things. So check that out, and we hope you all enjoy that. We're going to be doing those periodically, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. If you'd like to become a patron of Red Library for as little as $1 a month, that is less than a quarter an episode, you can get access to all of our exclusive content, special patron-only episodes, our Discord server, book groups, roundtable discussions, movie nights, and everything else. We're building a very thriving and wholesome leftist community, so come check it out. You can find a link for our Patreon page in the show notes, or just go to www.patreon.com, that's Patreon/Red Library Podcast, and you should find us there no problem. Remember to like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you are listening on iTunes, go down, maybe write us some spicy or icy cold comments, either approving or disapproving of the show. We really don't care, honestly. We answer to no one. We will never explain ourselves. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons Podcasting Network, a collection of shows focused on developing the dialectical pessimist perspective. That includes us, our podrades over at the Regrettable Century, and From 78. Remember, we have a monthly roundtable discussion with a varying cast of characters from all the shows talking about all sorts of things related to politics, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and all that other good stuff. You can find a link for that in the show notes, or just search on your favorite podcasting app. Well, here we are still, after all. Here we go, y'all. Enchantments of Mammon. Enchantments of Mammon Part 4. We'll see you back here afterward.
Typical Kevin bullshit.
That's what we'll start with. Just cut everything up until I say that, and then we'll start the show. Nobody will ever know what that typical Kevin bullshit is.
It's time to start.
Yeah.
Jamming with Mammon.
Dove.
Yeah. It's time for Jammin' Some Mammon Part 4. I've been thinking really hard all week about another phrase to include, and I decided I wanted to say that tonight we're putting it there with McCarraher and Jammin' Some Mammon on Part 4.
Well, that's
up the radio DJ quotient just a little bit.
Listen, I already do a bunch of reggaeton air horns and shit behind me already. So, I mean, we're just trending more and more towards radio DJ land. That's the idea. You all are just along for the ride.
Yeah, we gotta adopt like personas like in 90s radio DJs. Be like, you're here in the spin zone with the shark and the maniac.
That just liquefied my whole psyche just hearing you say that.
And then in the background, it's Guns N' Roses, obviously. It's the guitar solo from November Rain.
I was just listening to a podcast that will not be named the other day talking about the November Rain video and Slash's guitar solo. So yeah, that's very fitting.
Oh man, maybe that's in my brain from when I fell asleep listening to some podcast, and it just played various podcasts throughout the night. And I woke up to some really awful garbage.
Are you saying that Slash's guitar solo from November Rain is awful garbage?
they got pretty down on something that we've been talking about a lot lately in this, and something that we'll actually talk about a little bit more in the future chapters, and that would be the sacralization of corporate culture.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, no, that was actually a good episode.
It was a really good episode.
Yeah.
The awful garbage I woke up to was not that.
Yeah.
Some other unnamed awful garbage I was listening to.
some even more unnamed, even more garbage.
All right, well, time is of the essence. So, CC Don, you're in the driver's seat for part 4 tonight, yeah?
Yeah, well, that's what I took notes for it. I wouldn't say that I'm in the driver's seat, but I did take notes, yes.
We're all collectively driving the car in different directions at the same time.
I took some notes too, so I'll be able to talk a little bit.
Okay.
And I could words.
That might be useful.
Yeah. I am with you, Comrade Jason. I can also words tonight a little bit.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Cool.
Well, I think we should also just say that we're starting off this episode, and we just got to give a shout out to our fallen homies, R.I.P. Kevin, and also R.I.P. Alex.
Yep. R.I.P.
Yeah. Kevin was eaten by a wolf.
Yeah, but that's very fitting for Kevin. He would be eaten by a wolf.
Yeah, just like the sun. Because he's all into Nordic paganism.
Yeah.
I was just waiting for you to explain exactly what that meant.
Google Fenrir.
Hear that, everybody? It's no longer Google Murray Bookchin, it's Google Fenrir. And Alex died. He fell on a sharp piece of obsidian as he was hunting for Atlantis.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace, fallen comrades, martyrs. He'll never be forgotten.
R.I.P. in peace.
Yeah. R.I.P. in peace. Hashtag blessed. All right.
So
Let's do it.
So we have the first chapter.
All right, take us seriously, everyone.
Yes.
No, don't worry. Adam's going to clean all that up. It's going to flow so smoothly.
It's going to pop.
No, it won't. It's just going to be dumb guy shit for the first 20 minutes. But
So chapter 12, the producer's Jeremiad, which is the populist reformation of the covenant. So we're starting off, gives a little bit of historical context to what's going on, which is the changes in the 1870s were widespread industrialization, population growth in the Midwest, and subsequent dependence on urban hubs, common debt peonage in the South, and poor crop harvests and a low global agriculture prices. So workers, not only in the urban centers, but also in small towns, are uprooted and placed in precarious positions. And let me read a quote from page 262. It says, "The global agricultural cataclysm aggravated the already exorbitant shipping charges, increased the already usurious interest rates, accelerated foreclosures on farm mortgages, and underscored with brutal clarity the dependence of farms on a structure of finance and distribution controlled by distant monopolies and trusts." So there's increasing distrust and contempt between urban and rural areas. And so we see out of this, we see the growth of the populist movement. So the populist movement was a collection of agrarian labor and other reform organizations in all regions of the country that pushed for issues like women's suffrage, workers' rights, and the regulations on monetary and transportation sectors. Cooperatives, community-owned businesses, and the abolition of the gold standard were popular goals. And then he kind of gets into some historiography about more contemporary interpretations of the populist movement. Starts off with a historian named Hofstadter that kind of sees the populist as reaction and resentment by moralizers upset by their failures in the marketplace. And then he also wants to talk about Goodwin and Lasch, who we are going to have, we're going to talk about in a episode coming up.
Also, Richard Hofstadter is who wrote, The Paranoid Mind in American Politics. Which I think is a lesser known work, but is basically just sort of talking about the role of conspiracy and paranoia as it's just baked into the assumptions of like the U.S. political system.
Interesting.
Anyway, I think he wrote that in the 50s. I think it's a lesser known book now, but I've read sessions of it, and it was I don't know. It's interesting to think about him talking about Hofstadter here, and that's something that I think it was one of his more famous books. We talked about how the conspiranoia or secret society elements are not here. So I don't know, make of that what you will, but I just find it interesting that we're talking about Hofstadter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, is this the appropriate place to take issue with the historiography?
Of course,
it's always the appropriate place.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to go grab a stack of books real quick.
Oh, shit. That wasn't a joke.
Yeah.
He's actually going to get a stack of books.
Is it Jason missed his calling as a historian of American socialism?
Well, me and CC Don were saying that this might be the most contentious section that we do yet, because this is going to be in that wheelhouse for at least a handful of the chapters. So, all right, pull out that dagger. Let's do it. Where your dagger's at, Jason?
I'm missing one of the books I was looking for, but I did grab 4 of them. And the issue that I want to take with the way that not just Hofstadter, 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 but also McCarraher, the way that the treatment that the populist movement gets in this chapter is very it's in line with, I think, the American socialist tradition's typical view of the populist tradition, and I think it's a mistake. It basically treats it as a monolith, and it treats it the same way that the sort of productivist wing of social democracy has historically dealt with the peasantry in Europe or the farmers as a class, which is to regard it as backward-looking and reactionary and small proprietor, mentality that's very parochial and not having a common interest with the labor movement. I think he even describes the marriage between the Knights of Labor and the Grange and the various agricultural societies as kind of somewhat incoherent. That's not the word he uses, but I didn't write it down. And I just think that that's not true. And so for a couple of reasons. And the first is just that once the populist movement declines and American socialism becomes the repository of radicalism, and you get the American Socialist Party, in the next chapter, the most radical wings of the Socialist Party are all former populist strongholds. So they're all in the West and in the South, and it's all of the agrarian socialist tradition where you get the most radical. That's where you get the Green Corn Rebellion. That's where you get the timber wars, and the United Mine Workers tradition actually goes all the way back to the early agrarian radical traditions. And it's the city, urban-based reformer wing of pre-Socialist Party socialism that is the right wing of American socialism in Debs' day. And so I was trying to remember who it was, but it's not Hofstadter. It's Robert C. McMath wrote a great book called American Populism: The Social History. Looks like this. And he really rips to shreds. And so does Jim Bissett and agrarian socialism in America. But he really rips to shreds the idea that populism is a movement of the petty proprietor who just wants a slightly bigger piece of the pie for himself and doesn't want, he wants free, fair competition, and that sees the trusts as being an unfair advantage. This idea that's a pure capitalism that populism aspires to. I thought it was really funny that McCarraher basically points to a couple of intellectual figures that he regards as the leading lights of populism. And he doesn't mention Tom Watson, who's the main one, and he doesn't mention Terence Powderly. Terence Powderly's Knights of Labor. There's the other guy. James B. Weaver.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
He got 1,041,028 votes in the 1892 presidential election, which is 8.5% of the vote. So when you think about these third party candidates that make a splash, like Ralph Nader, James Weaver kicks the shit out of Ralph Nader as a radical anti-system candidate. But the people he does mention are Ignatius Donnelly, who prior to reading this book, not only did I not know he was a part of the populist movement, I have actually only known Ignatius Donnelly as the author of a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly is responsible for basically the repopularization of the Atlantis myth in the English-speaking world. I had no idea he was connected to any politics ever. So I thought he was a really funny, primary intellectual figure of the movement, since I never heard of him, at least in this capacity. And then the other one is William Jennings Bryan, who's universally regarded as the guy who destroys the movement. So I just think that he gives short shrift to a incredibly important movement. He kind of just papers over it with the least interesting parts of it, and he skips over all of the most useful parts of it.
So I have 2 questions then to y'all based on this. Number one, why do you think that is, or what do you think is leading to that like papering over an omission of maybe the most vital figures in the populist movement. And I guess the second thing I would ask too is like, does this also call into question other parts of the book and the historiography and other sections? Because, I mean, I'm not a scholar expert on a lot of these particular movements that he's talking about. And so it does make me sort of wonder about his methods or his particular perspectives based on that.
I don't know if I could say for certain, because what he does do effectively in this same chapter is his treatment of the Socialist Party's attitude toward the populist movement, which he basically adopts. He also he describes it accurately. I think the way he puts it is that the socialist movement was sort of, in the US anyways, that socialism was like reconciling the concept of socialism with the sort of producerist tradition. And he seems to be, he contrasts that with a kind of like that romantic naturalism that he identifies later with the arts and crafts movement and anarchism. But I think that the thing what's strange is that for how well he understands socialism and anarchism at this period, he doesn't understand its precursors, because the populist movement is essentially the Iggy Pop to their punk, right? Is that's the place where socialist radicalism gestates, is in a much more broadly defined kind of people's revolt against government and business that like later gels into more distinct and in some ways clarified political visions, and in other ways I think are somewhat backward. Like I've always thought that you could contrast the Bolshevik attitude toward the peasantry in Russia with the American socialist attitude toward the farmer. And you can see the seeds of victory in the former and the seeds of failure in the latter, in terms of like where popular resentment and mobilization and organization and capacity is like not tapped into. I mostly think people don't know this. It's like a really specialized, it's real nerd shit, right? To be really interested in the populist movement. But I think it's too important to not mention, even if like maybe we can't fault McCarraher for not knowing it. I think his treatment of it is fair, considering like what information is out there. But I do think it's one of those records that has to be set straight like over and over again.
Hey, Kevin. Back from the dead.
I guess he beat that wolf.
He can't hear you yet.
He's connecting to audio. Yeah.
The main note that I wrote here was don't make the mistake of confusing populism to be monolithic.
Yeah.
It's probably a good idea for any particular set of social movements or historical trends, is to not paper them over in such a simplistic way. Yeah.
But you know who does do that is Eugene Debs and Victor Berger, like the main figures of American socialism. They basically have nothing to say to the radical farmers movement, because they see them as a class doomed to extinction, which is like true, but it just shows how not pragmatic American socialism has historically been. That it's like it's always been a kind of like, even when it's like at its height, it's always been a little bit too sectarian's not the right word, but like too purist, unwilling to get its hands dirty with like, up until the Communist Party with the Popular Front, but like unwilling to do these kind of like tricky, murky alliances.
Kevin, you're muted.
I'm aware.
Holy shit, that was like HAL 9000 coming online. Yeah. I am aware.
Oh no, Kevin has achieved awareness.
He's achieved sentience. What's up, RIP,
Kevin? Back. Welcome. Feeling better?
Back from the dead.
Yeah.
Can't complain too much.
You don't have to keep muting yourself at the end of, like, right before you finish your sentence.
Yeah, but it's easier.
It sounds really cool because you're like, yeah, I'm aware. Hey, how you guys do it?
You should just do that for every episode and just never explain what's going on. Yeah, Kev, you're still muted, man. I don't know if that's intentional now.
I don't know if you're just intentionally talking.
Do that now? I don't know. Is this a revolt?
Fucked up.
So the funny thing is he was telling us that he was muting himself on purpose, but he muted himself before he finished the sentence, so we didn't hear the explanation.
It's getting real meta. My head is hurting.
Okay.
All right, here we are still after all. Let's do it.
Get back into it.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay. So I guess you were Adam. You asked, should this call into question McCarraher's understanding of other things?
Yes.
Not necessarily. I think that we should always be willing to be skeptical about any historian's interpretation on something, but I think that he's really shown in a majority of what he's written so far that he's got a mastery of the subject. And I really think that his specialty lies in religious social movements in the United States. So whenever someone is commenting on something outside of their specialty, you can expect them to not have the depth of knowledge that might be required to talk about it in extreme detail, which is why he doesn't go into extreme detail. He goes into like 2 pages worth of detail, and that's about it, right? Or 4 pages worth of detail, whatever. So I don't know. I think that obviously we should be willing to be skeptical about anything that he says, as much as we like a lot of what he says. But I don't know. I feel like he seems as though he's been pretty spot on from what I can tell. And being the European history guy, maybe I just don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. That's always a possibility.
No, that's fair. Yeah, I guess it just was something that I at least wanted to put it out there, and I think for, maybe listeners of Red Library, we talked a lot about just reading things critically, at the same time of reading them sympathetically as well. So I was just curious, for whenever that you do encounter that in a book like this, especially something that's kind of like so monstrous and ambitious, should it be like give you pause to step back and think critically, maybe more than you would have on the other sections, perhaps.
One final thought on the Populist Party. That election where James Weaver runs and gets 1 million votes, the Socialist Labor Party, which at the time is the only socialist party in the country. I just had this figure and I already closed it. They get 21,000 votes. And even then they're like, oh yeah, why would we have anything to do with these agrarian radicals in the Populist Party? They represent a dying class. When they're nobody knows who the Socialist Labor Party is, no one cares. So it's a disease that has plagued American socialism since at least the 1890s.
Okay, so
hey man, they're still around.
Yes, the Socialist Labor Party is a disease that has plagued us since the 1890s.
No, I mean,
to reiterate,
they're still around. They really are. They exist in some form. I think it's 4 people, but they've still got a party that exists. And Populist Party, where the fuck are they?
Hey, good point. Yeah. History has vindicated their perspective.
That's right. The 4 people who are still in it, history has proven them correct. I will tell you really fast, I remember I was having coffee with a friend, and I was doing some organizing with in Austin once, and there was someone who walked in, and he was like, oh yeah, he's from, I think it was the World Workers' Party. And I'm like, oh yeah? I was like, how big are they? He was like, oh, it's just that one guy. But that one guy is the World Workers' Party. And I'm like, oh, okay.
At the Socialism Conference, every year you would have the same 2 guys from the League for the Revolutionary Party show up. And I asked someone from Chicago, how many of them are there? And they're like, 5?
Yeah, say that's baller percentages on representation. That's 20%. People showing up.
Those guys 40, were the most doctrinaire Trotskyist you've ever met. They were, every session they'd stand up and make an intervention about how we're fake Trotskyists and how Lenin said this, and then they would quote Lenin like the Bible. It was pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It was definitely pretty much something.
It was some sort of thing. Also, I just can't let this slide. Thank you, Don, for correcting my math.
Yeah.
Obviously, thank you for that. I appreciate it. That needed to happen.
Yeah, no problem. That's what I'm here for.
Oh yeah, you said 20%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So
Just move on. Just move on from that, please.
all right. So yeah, we mentioned McCarraher is talking about the different interpretations of the populist movement. So there's Hofstadter, who saw it as a reaction and resentment. Goodwin and Lasch, who saw it as an anti-capitalist. They're basically anti-capitalist prophets that were taking a stand against mechanization. And then he talks about somebody named Charles Pastel, who wants to challenge the dichotomy between those two and say that the populists weren't necessarily a rejection of modernity, but a struggle over its meaning and who benefited from it. But then McCarraher has this quote from 265. He says, if populism was an alternative model of capitalism, it was never an alternative to capitalism. Hofstadter's contempt for rural folk does not discredit the stubborn truth that he captured about American populism. It has never imagined a fundamental revision of property relations in America.
So, I mean, considering what you were just saying, Jason, I mean, like, what do you make of that? Like, does that actually seem to capture something, or does it capture maybe certain tendencies within certain populist groups, but not others?
I mean, I think that the appropriate way to do like a broad assessment of the populist movement would be to say that it was as broad as the term itself. So that for some sections of and some figures, you could say it was like a romantic anti-capitalism that rejected modernity. And for others, you could say it was a reform movement that in no way sought to challenge capitalism, but was in fact sort of like harkened back to a Jeffersonian palingenesis, right? And then in other cases, it's precisely this, not a rejection of modernity, but a challenge to what modernity will mean, right? Like there's a vision within the I think it's the Grange, but it also might be the Farmers Alliance. It's probably the Farmers Alliance, because that's also like deeply forward thinking on questions of segregation in the American South that even the American Socialist Party is not. That they have this worked out vision of like a cooperative commonwealth that is essentially like, it's similar to Bukharin's vision for how collectivization in the Soviet Union of agriculture would eventually grow over into a mechanized cooperative ownership of land that would rise in tandem with a cooperative ownership of the factories in the cities. So that's all under the same umbrella that's, vaguely understood as the populist tradition, and then like it has this political expression in the People's Party. But like it breaks in every direction. So that one section goes into the Democratic Party and gives it its progressive wing, and another section goes into the Socialist Party and gives it its most militant, class combat wing. So yeah, I think it's everything. It's the reason why like a very rigid sectarian approach to politics would give certain people in socialism an allergy to populism, because it's like vague and chaotic and hard to define. Kind of like the people more generally. I do like what he says here. Populism offers a Rorschach test of scholarly and political thinking. I think that's right. You kind of see in it what you want, and you can find in it what you see.
So like most social movements.
Right, exactly, right. I mean, that's the reason why we have a politics which is like slightly more, we'd like to think more developed and clear-headed, but it's oriented toward the vague populism that exists in the broadest masses of the population.
Don, one thing I wanted to tag that I do think is important here is right after you finished your quote, he says, history from the bottom up, quote unquote, was supposed to uncover a people of prophets speaking truth to power. But what if the truth the prophets uttered was the truth of power, expressed in a populist style and vernacular? So maybe that's kind of also just a succinct way to put that, is again, like, maybe not entirely, but there were elements that maybe, again, like had this populist sort of form, but were, again, sort of kind of speaking the exact language of power and capitalism itself.
All right, so moving on from there, he starts to talk briefly about the Knights of Labor, which was a society influenced by Catholicism and Freemasonry, which included things like libraries, parades, concerts, dances, festivals. Ultimately, they wanted to eliminate wage labor, but did not want to abolish class, and they wanted to harmonize labor and capital. They eventually lost influence in the 1890s. I don't know if you all want to talk about more from that part or not.
Just briefly,
Sure, yeah.
I thought all of the descriptions of the rituals and everything of the Knights of Labor as like being very much like an esoteric secret society sounded pretty fucking dope. Like I'm into that. Can we do that? But communist? Like I'm totally down. We could start like a society of god builders and base it off of like Lunacharsky's ideas, and it'll be like a secret. Don't want to say fraternity. What is it when you have a fraternity of everyone that's all genders, whatever that is.
Wait, isn't that fraternity?
No.
Well, is it?
I thought,
Because why would they have a word for sorority if fraternity encompassed everything?
I think it's one of those archaic words where like fraternity meant the universal, but then there's also a separately existing word for the feminine version. Are you Googling fraternity now?
somebody should, but somebody else should just Google the Knights of Labor logo because it's awesome.
Mm-hmm. And just for Lost Horizon Network listeners, join our top Patreon tier and get access to our communist rituals that we'll be doing.
Yes, our communist secret society, the whatever the the non-gendered word for fraternity of god builders is. Oh wait, because God is a masculine fraternity too. So I'm just kidding.
So one thing I want to say about the Knights of Labor that I guess he sort of hints at, but he doesn't really deal with in too much detail, is he does describe the decline of the Knights of Labor and their replacement by the American Federation of Labor, and the turn towards Gomper's his vision of like business unionism or whatever. But I don't recall that distinction being drawn out enough to where it sounds like it's significant. Mm-hmm. Because in my mind, the Knights of Labor are like a massively more advanced than the AFL was. You don't really get the Knights of Labor's kind of spirit in American labor again until the IWW or the CIO, in terms of its like all workers, like organize all workers regardless of skill, regardless of color, regardless of craft, regardless of gender, nationality, etc. Like that's ancient's the wrong word. That's an old labor tradition that the IWW and later CIO pick back up after it is set down, and the Knights of Labor are where like the kind of the origins of it. So there are problems with the whatever class harmony vision of someone like Terence Powderly, but they're not any worse than those of either today's labor leaders, people like Richard Trumka or whoever. I don't. My current labor history is a little bit dated. Trumka was president like 14 years ago, but like the current leadership of American labor or the Gompers era are still backward compared to Powderly and the Knights of Labor. And I don't think that he gives them quite as much credit as they deserve in terms of being like our origin story for like a class first radicalism, which sees the emancipation of race and of gender as being bound to the emancipation of labor.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Knights of Labor rose and fell pretty quickly, right? Like their actual lifespan was only 20, 30 years, something like that?
Something like that. I mean, it's funny because it's kind of like the IWW in that.
Yeah.
I mean, technically the IWW still exists, but there's a heyday, and it's basically one generation. And the same is true with the Knights of Labor.
So I wanted to tag a quick quote. This is on the bottom of 266. McCarraher says, weakened by internal strife and opposition from employers, the Knights progressively withered. While historians often point to factional disputes and external pressures, to explain the order's demise, we must also wonder whether it was blinded and crippled by its fidelity to capitalist covenant theology. So I was curious, I mean, do you think that does that make sense, or how does that strike you all as sort of a possible, at least factor in the explanation of why they declined and withered so quickly? Was, again, they were kind of buying into this capitalist theology, or i.e. Mammonism, I guess.
Well, yeah, they weren't really offering much of an alternative, really. When the workers' movement is shifting into the Socialist Party, or, the rural movements are shifting into the Populist Party and into organized labor, the Knights of Labor just seem to be superfluous at this point because they didn't offer a distinctive enough alternative. And that could be due to their ties to that old Mammonistic theology. I don't know. I don't think I'm educated enough on the subject to be able to tell whether or not that's right or wrong.
Okay, that's fair. I was just curious. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jason probably knows something, but he wasn't here when you asked the question.
Sorry, I walked away to get water because you could probably hear me going like the whole time I was talking.
I was asking, McCarraher says on the bottom of 266 that part of why the Knights withered so quickly is because they basically bought into capitalist sort of Mammonism, and I was curious just what y'all thought about that as at least a partial explanation of why they did wither so quickly.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not this book is the first time I've come across that particular, or at least in my memory, that critique of the Knights of Labor. I kind of think I have always sort of thought of it more like there's a reason I keep comparing it to the IWW, and the CIO. And the CIO is long lasting, it has the longest life of the three because of its ultimate kind of capitulation, I think, to the standards of American business unionism. Like, this country has had a historically brutal ruling class when it comes to dealing with like organized labor. So there's either been like a beaten down and cowed labor leadership or an insurgent one, and the insurgent one, like, you can't just exist in perpetuity in quasi rebellion, right? So I'm not prepared to say that he's wrong, but I certainly wouldn't say like its primary cause for its downfall is like how did you put it, an acquiescence to Mammonism.
Yeah, he says it was blinded and crippled by its fidelity to capitalist covenant theology.
That's not at all the way I remembered. Acquiescence to Mammonism is a different thing altogether.
No,
but yeah,
that would be just different words for the same shit, man.
Yeah, they seem similar.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm a little rusty on the subject, so I don't want to. I feel like I'm resting a lot on my memory of something I've studied a lot, but like it's been a long time.
Well, I think maybe just for listeners, we can just kind of let everyone know that it's okay to not know things sometimes, or to be like, I'm not really sure.
I don't know a lot of things a lot of times.
I don't know most things I talk about on any of our shows.
Speaking of things I don't know about, let's move on to...
totally making shit up.
It's all just a huge psyop. All right, CC Don, let's do it.
So I'm gonna touch briefly on Henry George, and then we'll move on to Ignatius Donnelly. So Henry George is another figure that he wants to talk about briefly. For the populist movement, he was a religious writer and journalist. He thought that to produce was to participate with the divine, so progress meant everyone participating in production, so that everyone could participate with the divine power. And he celebrated technological and scientific modernity. After that, he wants to move on to Ignatius Donnelly, who is, he spends quite a bit of time on actually in this chapter, is an agrarian populist who objected to large corporations, but not necessarily corporations in general. He was self-taught and against the university elite, and he used a wide range of subjects like history, geology, and astronomy, but his scholarship seemed, at least according to McCarraher, very, very poor. So he used things like Atlantis.
I think that's a dig.
Yeah.
Oh, he does talk about Atlantis.
Yeah. Because he used things like Atlantis and Ragnarok to talk about progress as being creation, disaster, and then further creation. So he used evangelical themes and inspirations, but rejected Christianity at an early age. He thought that sloth, luxury, and decadence were punished by a god who never stops working. I guess he didn't really like the idea of the Sabbath or anything like that. Also, Rand just really didn't like Shakespeare. I don't know if you guys remember that, but apparently Donnelly just hated Shakespeare for some reason. Didn't really go into that much.
It's among his
this guy.
It's among his many flaws.
Never stop working and Shakespeare sucks. Sounds like bullshit.
Yeah. It turns out that his Atlantis, his writings on Atlantis are his best work.
Burn.
That's right. Me and all my homies hate Ignatius Donnelly.
So he wrote a lot of fiction that was both social criticism and prophecy. And this, I'm going to take a quote from 274 here, that his works describe corporate plutocracy as a malevolent form of enchantment. They outline an eschatology of judgment, deliverance, and producerist redemption, and imagine a beloved commonwealth of proprietors based on a sacramental view of the world. But he felt no responsibility or concern for the poor, and Donnelly's Enchanted World, so this is another quote, this will be from 277. Donnelly's metaphysics and theology represented a populist romanticism. The world is full of spirits, cycles upon cycles of creators, universe unfolding, universe of activities and labors, endless arrays of angels and archangels, cherubim and seraphim. So that was, sorry, I'm trying to plow through some of this stuff since I know we're already going a little bit long on time. Anything else you guys wanted to touch on with Donnelly? I think he was a very interesting character.
Yeah, I thought he was super interesting, and I could see little bits and pieces of some kinship with German Volkish movements that it would have existed around this time. Not future German Volkish movements that ended up exterminating, a bunch of Jews or anything, but the German Volkish movements who were kind of populist, sort of quasi, socialist / corporatist / whatever. But yeah, there's some overlap here.
Yeah,
especially with the
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm good. I'm done.
I refuse. Ignatius, look, it's just that the reason why I interrupted what you were saying is just going to seem so much sillier now because it was an interruption. All I was going to say was that Ignatius Donnelly probably would have been like a Death in June Volkish kind of person rather than like an actual Nazi.
Okay, cool.
That really meaningfully contributed to the episode. That's right. Remember, me and Jason represent the real dumb guy shit from each of our shows. So,
I mean, I feel like if people listen to these shows, this is what they're looking for, right? Is takes like that.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Don't kid yourselves. You know why you're here. Chris, were you also going to say that you also represent the real dumb guy shit movement?
Yeah, I also do.
We all do.
Yeah, we all do. We all got a little dumb guy shit in all of us.
Listen, nothing human is alien to me, including being a real dumb guy.
Okay. Kevin's too cool to participate in the real dumb guy shit usually.
Yeah, smart guy shit only.
Hell yeah, just hovering above the fray.
That's why he stays on mute the whole time. There's nothing down here for him.
He's like one of the immortals in Zardoz.
I've already exited Plato's cave, and I can see the sunlight and the trees. And what use have I for shadows on cave walls?
That's right. You didn't see the sun until you were already a man, and by then it was blinding.
I don't know, man. I think you might have to wait until your second year in college philosophy to answer that question.
Oh!
Shots have been fired, daggers have been sharpened and pulled, and we are about to maim each other brutally on this episode, apparently.
That's in this rhetorical battle, that's what my frigate did, a broadside.
Okay, we should fucking move on.
Okay, yeah.
It's gonna be our best episode yet.
I love it.
So I'll end with a few of McCarraher's closing thoughts on the populist. He thought that Donnelly, like many other populist Populists could not see the split in their thinking or follow the thread of their problems to capitalist logic itself. Free trade and the market lead to corporations and productive technologies. They cannot be excised from one another. And then another quote, I had a lot from this section from 279. He says, at the very least, this is kind of in the middle of the sentence, suggests at the very least that populists had enough in common with the establishment they vilified to broker electoral alliances. Indeed, since agrarian populists sought to reform, not abrogate the capitalist covenant, then the fusionist strategy marked less a betrayal than a culmination of their modernizing program. Bryan was an acolyte of the populist division, not a false prophet come from the plutocracy. So, yeah, that was kind of talking about William Jennings Bryan and that idea that he essentially betrayed the populist movement. I think for McCarraher, yeah, it wasn't necessarily a betrayal. It was just a continuation of the movement. And
I would say it's probably more like the triumph of one wing over the other.
Right. I was going to say, I know we've kind of already gone over this, but I think that that's the best way to put it. Is there's a wing of populism which finds a more appropriate home in the Democratic Party, and there's another wing that finds a more appropriate home in socialism. And the difference there is the Democrats sought out part of the movement to co-opt, and the socialists just waited for the other half to kind of come to their senses. And it's just a lesson in being deliberate versus waiting for the wind of history to fill up your sails. Part of the reason why the Democratic Party has been so successful is because they're ruthless in pursuing their aims. And part of the reason why we have been not successful is because we aren't.
All right. You guys want to hit the next chapter?
What are we on, 13?
Yeah, 13.
Let's do it.
All right, so chapter 13, the cross is bending, the socialist Jeremiad and the covenant theology. So the socialist movement encompassed a wide variety of people and viewpoints, including both religious and anti-religious. While many Americans near the turn of the century opposed socialism on religious grounds, others saw a connection between the ideas. And so this is kind of where he starts to talk about the social gospel. Okay, so this is from 282. But he says the social gospel was rarely a socialist gospel. And most of the Christian socialism that appeared was, as in Europe, tepid and ameliorative. Led by theologians, clergy, and seminarians, the social gospel exuded the musty air of the small-town pastor's parlor. When its acolytes sought to Christianize the social order, they signaled their acceptance of capitalist property and industrial regimentation. So the first thinker that he wants to pull out is Charles Sheldon, who's the author of In His Steps, which I think is pretty well-known or infamous, I don't know. Well-known, infamous, whatever you want to say. But Sheldon imagined business with a human face, where workers would be paid well and bosses would not be patronizing, but ownership was not fundamentally changed.
Hey, Don, can I tag in a really quick quote?
Sure.
I just want to make sure we get it in here. This is actually from 281, and it's just talking about the reaction, especially by certain clergy and pastors and such, to socialist, the rise of socialism. And I just love this quote. It says, "A year later, another minister noted that because he wanted to use the apostles' money for the poor," this is what he says, quote, "Judas was the only socialist among professed Christians," unquote. And then this is the thing I had to make sure we get in the episode. "Not to be outdone in vituperative ingenuity by Protestants, one Jesuit maligned socialists as, quote, hell's lowest vomit," unquote. So, welcome, fellow.
That's my new screen name.
Yeah, my new Twitter handle.
Yeah. In Europe, the rise of socialism is accompanied by a rise in Catholic social a Catholic social theology that includes a corporatist distributism, which would lay the foundation for a lot of other types of movements that used corporatism, not the least of which was the fascist movement. Yeah, so there's a rise in Catholic corporatism that is trying to combat the appeal of socialism to workers all over the place.
So one of the things that I found interesting, right, it's on the first page of this chapter, is a reference to John Spargo, who, he's quoted as saying that socialism provides a substitute for religion. And Spargo, he rightly calls him one of the movement's most prolific writers and popular speakers at the time, but he's largely forgotten because Spargo, like Jack London, who's also mentioned on the next page, they represent the right wing of the Socialist Party. They break with the party over the question of the war in 1914, so that like they basically, their wing leaving the party is like the reason why there are two socialist parties in the whole world that have the right line on the war, and it's the Russians and the Americans. And everybody else has like a right-wing leadership that, everyone knows the story. They kind of like side with the national bourgeoisie. But because John Spargo and Jack London and everybody like them had already left the party before, there was no pro-war socialism in the United States. So they're funny figures to like identify as like being such leading lights, because they are like early on, but they're like largely forgotten. So, just when the question of historiography comes up, McCarraher has done his homework, because most people don't know that Jack London was actually like quite the revolutionary up until the First World War. Also was a white supremacist.
Interesting.
He acknowledged that there was a contradiction between those two things, but he also like kind of washed his hands of it and said, "Hey, I'm a product of my time, man."
Aren't we all, Jack London? Aren't we all?
Yeah.
I feel like that's disingenuous. You can't say that about yourself.
Yeah,
That's what we can say about Jack London now that he's dead, but that's not what he can say.
I'm
like
a total
that-
piece of shit, but I'm just a product of my times, man.
I feel like it's that thing of like no one gets to decide that you're an asshole. Only people around you get to decide that you're an asshole.
Okay, should we move on? Anything else? Okay.
Yes, we shall.
Okay. Another person he wants to highlight just briefly before we hit Eugene Debs is Julius Weyland, who's the author of A Coming Nation and Appeal to Reason. And McCarraher says that his socialism was eclectic to the point of incoherence, and is basically represented like a small-town boosterism that sought to protect small businesses but not critique the system itself.
Oh, so like most socialists I know these days.
See, this is where I think this is why earlier the discussion about the populist tradition, I think it turns out that in this chapter it betrays a little bit more about McCarraher's politics, because that treatment of Debs, I think, is just like way off the mark.
Well, sorry, that was Weyland that we haven't hit Debs yet, although I think he might say similar things. So that
Oh, you did just say Weyland.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've been thinking about Atlantis all day.
Yeah.
This is the Atlantis episode, apparently.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah, we should do a whole Atlantis episode where all we do is do a Marxist critique of Atlantean myths.
Well,
let's stop this episode and do that episode right now instead.
I could lead that episode without notes, I'll tell you what.
Well, if we brought Alex in, then
Yeah.
Yeah,
It would
actually,
literally
man,
just be
Alex
Jason
and
and
I are
Alex.
Alex and I are going to start our own podcast.
We'll have a special Lost Horizons show that's just Alex and Jason's Atlantean myths.
it could be called Red Atlantis.
Holy shit. Oh my god. R.I.P. Alex, wherever you are, whenever you hear this, you're now locked into doing that spin-off show.
I hope somewhere up there, Alex is like looking down on us and, thinking about our Atlantis and hoping that, we do him justice, man.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I hope that somewhere out there Kevin's looking down on us, but not like the way he normally looks down on us, with like a sense of intellectual superiority. So I am sorry for getting us so off course here, and I know that that's been sort of my role, but it's just it's not one that I relish. It's just one that I accept.
Yeah. Listen, someone has to do it.
I like how we're getting these sick burns in on Kevin, and he's here, and he's not saying shit.
He's just you can just watch him laughing on mute.
Well, listen.
I don't have a sense of superiority. I just know that I'm better. That's all.
I was going to say that Kevin is taking the road that the Democratic Party decided to take. He's taking the high road while we're going low.
Oh, that's right.
Okay, yeah.
See, that's why they don't win anymore, because they're no longer leaders.
There was
So
actually
we were
something
the Frasier
meaningful that
episode.
came out of that.
So what I was saying about in defense of Debs against the charges levied against Weyland.
Well, wait till we get to Debs.
Well, right. No, what I'm trying to say is I don't know if I can mount the same defense of Weyland. So I will now give the floor back to our host.
Okay, so we are going to get to Debs now.
Great. Well, then I stand by what I said.
Yeah. So for Debs, he wants to. There's probably some more stuff that y'all want to pull out, but I just had a few points that McCarraher wanted to talk about. One, that he hated the clergy and religious elites, but was treated with almost messianic reverence by large crowds, despite his own discomfort with that idea. So McCarraher says that his socialism was a reclamation of corrupted but redeemable promise. And he sought for worker control of businesses, but believed large-scale mechanized production was inevitable. And then I had 2 quotes that I was going to read from 289. So this is a bit of a long quote. All right, this is the very top of 289. True to Marx and Engels' endorsement of industrial despotism, this acquiescence in Fordist techniques of corporate domination was common among socialists, as anarchists and other communists recognized at the time they supported what amounted to state capitalism, the retention of hierarchical relations and methods of capitalist property and production. Indeed, Debs' failure to recognize any conflict between democracy and corporate consolidation was shared by Lenin, who famously embraced the Taylor system, thereby confirming that the authoritarian features of Soviet industry were modeled directly after the most imperious brand of American corporate discipline. And then a little bit later in that paragraph, Debsian socialism lent an unwitting sanction to the authority of industrial management. The producerist tradition, to which Debs is regarded as the socialist heir, did not and could not serve as a reliable, let alone effective source of opposition to corporate power. So I'm assuming, Jason, this might be the time when you can respond to those charges.
As you might imagine, I have something to say here.
Yeah.
No, I just think that it's like, I think that I can agree with a certain criticism, both of Debs in the particular and of the early socialism of the Second International more generally, as being like not sufficiently ruthlessly opposed to what they saw as the inevitable corporate consolidation. But I think that both when it comes to like ascribing motive, both to Debs and to Lenin, I think McCarraher is way off the mark here. Especially, I mean, I don't want to say especially Debs over Lenin, but I think when you read the speeches of Eugene Debs and you look at the work of his life, you just, I don't see how a person could make the claim that McCarraher just made. I mean, like, his entire essence is nothing but like a deeply heartfelt like revulsion against not just poverty, but also of the erosion of democracy that the trusts and the capitalists and the landlords and bankers represent. And he talks about it constantly. His 2 primary points of reference in all of his speeches are the work of Jesus Christ and the promise of the American Revolution, neither of which have been yet fulfilled and both of which will be fulfilled by the coming of the cooperative commonwealth. So like, he's adamant about democracy and about like individual self-expression and the freedom of that is promised by the bourgeois revolution as being just around the corner once the working class takes control and inaugurates a period of true democracy. And his main heroes in life were Victor Hugo and John Brown, who he said if there was any single person he would emulate, if he could, it would be John Brown. So that he would give his life in order to bring freedom to those who had not yet experienced it. And in that sense, what he meant was the worker. So like, leaving Lenin aside and just focusing on Debs, I just think like this treatment here on this one page is just far too cursory of a like surface level, like it either betrays like a hostility or else an ignorance to who I think is probably like the best figure in American socialism, at least up until maybe of like our entire history. So obviously I'm partisan here, but I'm a big Debs energy.
BDE in the episode tonight. So I did want to...
I think it's... Sorry.
Go for it, Chris.
I was about to say, I think it's just like he's revealing his political leanings here.
Yeah.
In his criticisms, and
Yeah.
I think that I'm going to reveal mine in saying that, like, when referring to Lenin or as a state capitalist and Marx and Engels as state capitalists is kind of insane.
It's dumb and wrong.
I think yeah. So I think like Lenin, of course, advocated a form of state capitalism later on as a method of, keeping Russians from starving to death and to be able to build up the industry necessary to fend off all of the invading capitalist powers. But that's all, in hindsight, we can see what happened there. I don't think there was anything inevitable about the authoritarian turn in the Soviet Union. I don't think there were, and he sort of sees inevitability in the roots of, in the Lenin's quote unquote adoption of Taylorism. I do see that as being a potential problem, but I don't see it as an inevitability. I think it's sort of anachronistic to think of it that way.
The one thing I was going to mention is I feel like this is still a common critique whenever I've had discussions with people who, identify themselves as like social democrats or democratic socialists, is that whenever you ask them about, what do they think of, the USSR, like the Bolshevik Revolution or whatever it might be, I feel like there's still a common criticism that people deploy. It's like, well, but yes, they thought about Taylorism and they really approved of all of that. And it always struck me as like a very strange, simplistic interpretation, because it feels to me like just a sort of a regurgitated talking point. And I was actually a little disappointed to feel like that critique is showing up in McCarraher, because I feel like at least, he feels like he's been very nuanced or sort of very generous in his critiques. Even with the Mormons or early sort of movements in Christianity or whatever, might be like, well, okay, there's all this really terrible shit, but then they also had these strains or sort of tendencies that could have been more, anti-capitalist, romantic or whatever. And I just feel like, he's doing our boys dirty here. They don't get any of that treatment. They're just immediately sort of dismissed or lumped in. As he says at the very end of that paragraph, he says, like scientific managers and corporate liberals, American socialists accepted and even celebrated the corporate mechanization of communion. And so I couldn't help but also read that as one of the things I mentioned on a past episode, I feel like this book is a sort of critique of ideology. And I can't help but wonder if this is sort of where that limitation really shows up, is that if you're just thinking about only quote unquote ideology of scientific management of Taylorism or whatever, and you collapse everything to just how someone interacted with that ideology, it obscures all the material complexities of not only social movements, but also these figures like Debs and even Lenin and Marx and Engels.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think
absolutely. So
there's a kernel that, so to do the dialectic with our critique of McCarraher. First, I came to the defense of Debs, and we came to the defense of Lenin and Marx and everybody. So now, just to kind of bring up the other end, I think I appreciate and I even admire where he's coming from, even if I don't agree with his conclusions, because there's a certain critique, a kind of romantic anti-capitalism that runs through the whole thing, which is why it's a book about religion in the first place, that I share. Right? There's a kind of there's almost like a Silvia Federici approach to the question of modernity and of industrialization, and it is the case that people like Lenin and Debs, and Engels, if not Marx, saw these things as not just inevitable, but historically progressive, and in some ways things to be celebrated. And we can see with some hindsight that even if there's a partial truth to that an overemphasis on production has been to the detriment of not just the world because the existence and perpetuation of capitalism, but I think in the realm of whatever ideology, it has also been a millstone around the neck of socialism as well, right? There's that quote that we really liked from Otto Spengler when we did the Dialectic of Defeat.
Oswald.
Oswald, yeah. The other most German name, Oswald Spengler, where he says that Marxism is the communism of capitalism. And he's partly right there in that there's
It's not wrong.
Right. There's slightly rose-colored glasses that we have looked at, through which we have looked at industrial development as something that is not just a potential net positive, but a inherently net positive gain for the human race. And like in the age of climate catastrophe, you can look and see how that maybe isn't exactly fucking true.
I just want to tag something on here real quick. I'm going to invoke some big Kohei Saito energy real quick since we just did an episode on it. I do think it is important to be able to understand that a lot of times the critiques of like productivism or what might be called Prometheanism in at least Marx and maybe even Engels to some degree, that a lot of times these critiques are grounded in a very, very limited and, you know, at the time, historically, very limited publishing of Marx's actual work that doesn't necessarily encapsulate the sort of transitions in his thought. So, listen, I'm always going to pull out the dagger and defend Zadie Marx. And I'm just saying, like, I think maybe in some ways, if you're going to lump Marx and Engels into that critique, maybe to some degree we have to be aware of, like, that's a fairly limited and maybe even simplistic understanding of the development of their thought.
Damn, that was a really good yes but to my yes but about the yes but.
Indeed.
I feel like through most of this book, he seems to be conflating as well, like scientific development with capitalism, like not only industrial development, but also scientific development with capitalism. And it just seems like that's like an assumption that he has, that those three things are always linked. And if you're not critical of one of those, or of all three of them, if you accept one of them, you're essentially accepting capitalist pecuniary logic. And I was just curious if y'all, I don't know, I definitely had some reservations about that assumption. I didn't know where y'all fell out with it.
Are you advocating fully automated luxury communism right now?
I don't think so.
No. I am not. I would like to
You're laughing at your own joke before you said it?
Yeah. I don't know if I can regain my composure long enough to say it.
I'm going to mute you anyway.
I would like to stop the de-terraforming process that has been inaugurated.
There's a deep lore that we're developing in this reading series.
All right. Well, let's move on then.
Well, what's your answer to that? I mean, do you feel like that is do you think that's a linkage or like an inevitability that he sees those things as linked, but you wouldn't agree with that, or you feel skeptical of that?
Yeah. I feel like at least I think that there's like at least the possibility that those things could be decoupled in some ways. Like I said, I think maybe with industrialization and modernization, it's harder to imagine, but at least I feel like some form of scientific development, I think it would look very different from what we have right now. And I think kind of I think part of what his problem is that it's seen as like, when it's seen as like some sort of eschatological vision or something like that, or some savior for humanity in the future, that's a problem. But I don't think that, just buying into some form of scientific progress is necessarily the same as seeing it as like salvific.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like seeing in scientific progress the ability to overcome droughts and famines, but not see it as the good itself. It would have to be the usage of scientific progress by the workers movement, like the worker state, right, or whatever, because I think that we've seen what scientific progress leads to, and I think that like that there's I don't have a coherent sort of ideological kind of position on this, but I start to see some of the criticisms of capitalist of the orthodox Marxist idea that capitalism would lead to the conditions that would make socialism necessary, and it might have been a better thing to see science develop under socialism than for it to develop under capitalism. But I don't know. That's just it's something I kick about because it's something that, like, I know it's something that a lot of, non-Marxist socialists and communists believe, and a lot of anarchists think would have been a better way to do things. But, I see the merits in that position.
Absolutely. I share them. And that's why I'm, despite some of the problems with her historiography, right? That's why I still think that Federici has like a basic thesis, which is one to engage with. As
much as I don't like her book, I think I agree.
Right, like we could get way off topic by talking about it, but that's just to say that to the extent that being a Marxist requires me to hold to a particular position about the necessity of capitalist accumulation in order to further scientific advancement, that's the extent to which I'm comfortable with my socialism not necessarily being fully Marxist. Like, I'm not prepared to reject it all the way, but neither am I prepared to accept it all the way. And this conversation reminds me of Chris Mano's defense of reason in our discussion with him in the Regrettable Century, where we kind of came at him with an anti-reason romanticism, and his defense of reason in defiance of not the critique of reason, but in defiance of reason as it is understood as part of the ideological apparatus of the bourgeoisie's kind of rule over society. It kind of gave me pause, and I think it's like it's a necessary corrective to, I think, what is also a necessary critique of like enlightenment and of reason and of scientific progress, which is absent in like the early social democracy of this period that we're talking about, of Debs and Spargo, and also of Lenin, right, of their contemporaries. So what we're really trying to do is like not repeat their mistakes, but also not completely just reject their entire legacy, I think. And that's a difficult needle to thread. That's basically been the project of, at least of our podcast, or one of them, for coming up on 2 years now.
Yeah. So I'm actually curious for R.A.P. Kevin, would you say we should reject all of this and return to Monkey?
It depends on what day you ask me.
Same.
I definitely resonate deeply with the sense that Jason and Chris are developing in this conversation of not having a solid position entirely staked out, but having a sense of being in transit, in evolution, an active evolution of thought around the subject matter. I think that there are a lot of serious and important critiques to be had about technology and scientific progress as such that are not encapsulated in a classical Marxist account of the world and of capitalism. But it does contain, just like the basic point in it of capitalism gives rise to the possibility of socialism in a manner that in a material manner that never pre-existed. There have been many attempts by many socialists to sort of go to realize agrarian socialisms, and to realize pre-agrarian socialisms, and to construct communes and try to build socialism out of different existing social forms other than the proletariat. And none of them have really gone anywhere except for dying little the communes that are at best a minor footnote in history. But proletarian socialism is a very real thing that really exists in the world today, that really threatens capitalism and looms large in our ongoing existence, not to mention our recent history of the world. So I that alone, I think, speaks volumes to the argument that capitalism is a necessary precondition for socialism. But it's definitely not the end of the story.
Triumphalist argument. No. All right.
Okay.
Wait, I think I have some connectivity or something. What'd you say?
I said, is that a triumphalist argument?
I don't know. Like, how so? What do you mean? Explain what's a triumphalist argument.
Or he will fucking kill you.
I just specifically referring back to the Dialectic of Defeat episode that we did, where we talked about how Stalinists would often just blow off criticisms of Stalinism by saying, well, like, your Trotsky guy or whatever, or your fucking Frankfurt School people, whatever, they don't, obviously the Soviet Union exists, and where are they?
Right, like we won, and the proof is in having achieved victory or having achieved power. So, like, criticisms are by anybody who has not won a revolution are not to be accepted.
Yeah,
and that's even a tenable position to have in like 1960, right? But not in 2020. Whenever looks like we've all fucking lost.
Oh yeah, we're all fucked.
Yeah, no one is the winner anymore.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna.
But that was mostly just a joke. I'm glad we went off on it for a few minutes, though.
Yeah.
I'll edit.
We're really
all
good
of
at being
that
pressed
out.
for time.
So so let's last person who wants to touch on in this chapter is, I don't know how to, is it Book White? I don't know.
Ron White,
The Call of the Carpenter, the author of that one. He had Jesus as a working class rebel who worked towards a paradise here and now. And he wanted to say that White was nearly the only Christian socialist who did not buy into the necessity for mass mobilization. Similar to Morris and Ruskin, socialism's children should be the artisan and the craftsman. But then he ends the chapter by saying that White's vision was largely ignored in favor of Sheldon's idea of capitalism, but just a little bit more polite. So we can move on to the next chapter, which is The Priesthood of Art, Anarchism, Arts and Crafts, and the Re-enchantment of the World. All right, so unlike the socialist movement, the anarchist and the arts and crafts movement wanted to change the fundamental methods of production, not just the ownership of the factories. Art, beauty, and pleasure were their essential values. So starting with anarchism. So again, he kind of wants to say that there is a debated and complex legacy for historians. The pro is that they were generally against World War I, and they were for sexual liberation and civil liberties, self-expression, and criticism of capitalism were their kind of main thrusts. The con for the anarchist movement was minuscule support among the working class, and politics was transformed into entertainment that could be easily co-opted, commodified, and sold. So any of you guys want to touch on that before I move on?
Well, I just wanted to mention that on 297 he talks about Christopher Lasch's critique, and he says that. Let me see. I'm going to pull this here. He says, in Lasch's view, he was talking about the Armershire and Patterson strike pageant of 1913, so talking about the coalescence of culture and politics under the auspices of Bohemia. Says that exposed the left to a, quote, insidious kind of exploitation, the transformation of radical politics into entertainment. Let me see here. There's something else I was going to pull. It says, indeed, in this view, the Bohemian radicalism augured colorful new styles in corporate cultural authority, staging a rehearsal for the quote-unquote conquest of cool, and that the quote-unquote lyrical left in this view was an exotic, iridescent laboratory for commodity fetishism, a vibrantly unprofessional research and development division of the culture industry. I just wanted to say that on the next page, on the top of 298, again, he's sort of going back and saying, well, okay, sure, but there's this other element, there's this other strain or trend that we want to also, again, sort of like salvage. He says, yet even if these forms of resistance to industrial capitalism degenerated into the lifestyle politics of, quote, bourgeois bohemians, unquote, it remains essential and rewarding to revisit the promise these movements once held and might still possess, if we knew how to adduce it. So basically, I was curious what y'all thought about this, because I'm like, he just spent a chapter like tearing down Eugene Debs, like papering over the complexities of the populist movement, and now we're talking about the arts and crafts movement, and he's basically like, well, yeah, I mean, it just glorifies commodity fetishism, leads to this like bourgeois bohemian lifestyle kind of politics. Well, maybe there was some good stuff there, and I just found the treatment of these two different things so massively uneven that, again, it betrays, I think, his own political commitments a little too much.
Yeah.
And I really do think it does a disservice to the history itself.
Yeah.
I think so too. That was going to be my comment on it.
Yeah, I was going to say you could very easily swap out a couple of words and say the American Socialist Party is praised as crusaders for feminism, sexual freedom, and civil liberties, and are remembered as courageous opponents of American participation in World War I. But then you wouldn't have to put the other part about how their, bohemian radicalism made them easy prey for recuperation, which is my truncated way of recapitulating the whole thesis here.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear Lasch saying all of this stuff when he wrote it, which was, I guess, in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Because damn, is that poignant now.
Yeah, it sure is. So I think it's worth teasing out not just the obvious distinctions between anarchism and the arts and crafts movement, which is really not a good name for
it. Really isn't. It just makes me think of oh look, I made a dinosaur out of macaroni.
Isn't that what anarchism really is when we get down to it?
Who's the?
I love you, our anarchist comrades. It was just a little bit of a friendly shots fired. Don't mind that.
Who's the anarchist that assassinated Henry Frick? Is Alexander
Berkman.
Yeah, I mean, Berkman, Goldman, that generation of anarchists.
All the men. Berkman, Goldman.
Yeah.
It's damn.
Even Lucy Parsons, considered herself an anarchist.
Yeah.
But also considered herself a Marxist. And it's kind of just. I think it's important to sort of acknowledge the liminal space that exists between what we now understand as a distinct socialist tradition and a distinct anarchist tradition.
Oh yeah.
These terms are used by some people interchangeably to describe themselves, just as much as they're used by the liberal press to describe irresponsible reformers, as opposed to the responsible reformers that you can find in the Democratic Party. There's plenty of common overlap between the two, not just in terms of our aspirations, but also in terms of the human material from one year to the next. So it's not that it isn't true what he says about all of the litany of positive attributes of American anarchism. It's just that they're also true of American socialism, and often for the same reasons, and often they're personified by the same people. But so perhaps what's more important, though, is the most damning critique that you could levy against any philosophy, movement, organization, or individual who aspires to transform the world, which is this: never received support from more than an infinitesimal fraction of the working class. And that's really all that needs to be said here, is if you're trying to compare the socialism of Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party to the anarchism of anyone in the United States throughout the entire history of the country, there's no contest. And this is not a triumphalist argument, because we've lost in both cases, right? The argument is that socialism, as maybe too overly personified by Eugene Debs, is a mass movement of the American working class in the millions. And that's why he's adored like a living Jesus figure, during his lifetime. And why Emma Goldman is adored by people who think we shouldn't have heroes other than Emma Goldman.
Yeah, well, I'm going to pull out my Yosemite Sam 6-shooters.
Yeah. You could just dub in the cannon sounds from the 1812 overture right there.
I will indeed do that, sir. That was your.
I realized I just went on a 4-minute diatribe against anarchism, but I tried really hard to be nice.
I think
you did fine.
Yeah, I think you did well. I think it's the way you presented it would definitely fit into it's much more interesting and complex than that, comrades. I mean, it wasn't just shitting on them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think any of the anarchists that listen to our show are the kind of anarchists that would have a problem with that critique of anarchism.
Word.
I couldn't imagine that there exists an anarchist who's not a class struggle anarchist that is able to fucking stomach us.
That's right.
If they are listening, fuck them.
Yeah. I was going to say, then you should go find some other shows to listen to, comrades.
No. Keep listening. Please,
yeah.
And then change your mind.
How else are you going to get cool?
Like all of us.
Right.
Yeah, we're fucking cool dudes, man.
How else are you going to learn this real dumb guy shit unless you listen to us?
So I should say this is like an asterisk that should be like a footnote that should be added to all of my commentary every time we record. Is that I sometimes forget that we have different editing styles on our podcasts, and there's all kinds of inane bullshit that I say on the Regrettable Century that doesn't make it to the release.
Feel free to cut Jason's dumb shit out, okay?
Yeah, I have no idea how this actually is going to sound. I recognize always in retrospect, I'm like, oh, I have less control over the final product than usual.
Indeed. That's why you need to learn how to do editing.
Some of this should not be in there, but we'll just have to leave it to Adam to just
control the means of production.
Or me.
That's right.
Or Chris.
Yeah. Or Don, actually. Don also edits.
Yeah.
Really, I just leave it to everyone else to decide, but sorry to give you all so much work.
I made a post in the Patreon today about how I was sorry it's been taking so long to get episodes out because Jason and Kevin don't know how to use the computer, so it's up to me, and I'm going to grad school.
That was great. I laughed very heartily when I read that. I will say, Jason, that if I do the editing on this, I will promise to cut out some of this, but I'm going to save it in a secret file and keep it as compromat on you for the future.
Excellent. I mean, you could release like a... What's that? That's just dumb. Okay, so I always derail my own train of thought before I start.
It's pure death drive.
I was gonna say, it's like, whenever Anthrax released Attack of the Killer Bees, but then as soon as I started saying that, I was thinking, actually, that's just called an album of B-sides, and all bands do that. Anthrax isn't unique. But they are better than most bands who release B-side albums, even though Attack of the Killer Bees is actually a pretty shitty collection of songs. Then I thought, why am I saying any of this?
I'm definitely cutting all of this.
If I'm editing it, I'm cutting absolutely nothing.
Don's going to give you the super cut.
I get to pure delirium by the time we get around to recording after our work day. I'm much more cogent and intelligent and less disruptive on a weekend.
Oh, that is why
sounds less fun though.
Yeah, that is true. It's less solid gold. I don't know if y'all saw this, but what we've decided to do with like the Capitalism and Desire reading series is we usually bullshit for an extra hour afterwards. So we're just gonna release that uncut as the director's cut, or like the extra like director's edits of that episode. So yeah, I mean, Jason, don't be surprised if all of a sudden there's like a Patreon only release from Red Library, but it is just a collection of all the shit that you've said that has ended up on the cutting room floor.
I would actually totally celebrate that, because it would no longer be a distraction from what otherwise is a good discussion.
Cool. Yeah, I'm cool with that too, as long as you give me a copy of the file to release on our Patreon.
Cool.
I don't think. I don't know. We don't need it in both. I don't care what happens, actually. In an attempt to get out of the canoe and flip it back over, since I stood up and tipped it over
and shat on it.
Let's get back to it. All right.
I will say that McCarraher, what he says here, I don't know the page number. I'm looking at a weird PDF. He refers to the fact that both the anarchist and artisanal movements drew on European as well as indigenous sources. And then he lists a bunch of people and figures and movements and legacies. And I know we just went through the previous chapter on socialism, but I don't feel like he made as much of an effort to, again, say the same thing, which can be said that there's both a European as well as indigenous, although I guess that should be in quotes, because what we should mean is homegrown more broadly. That it's like socialism is not presented in all of its complexity in the American landscape the way that anarchism is, and it's to the detriment of the previous chapter, even though it's not to the detriment of this chapter. This is how both should have been treated.
I would agree.
All right, so the Seven Arts Circle is where he wants to talk about first. And it hated the influence of Puritanism and its quote-unquote will to power, and it claimed that there is no legitimate American tradition to continue. So this is a quote on page 300. I think this is talking about Puritans. This is their view of the Puritans. Obliged by their God to acquire omnipotence over nature and their own desires, the American descendants of the Puritan idealized a ferocious and aesthetically analgesic productivity. Insensitive to beauty, reproachful of idleness, and obsessed with sin and decline, Puritans imparted to subsequent generations the abhorrence of sheer delight. and it explored Native American spirituality, but ultimately did not think that it would be able to combat industrial progress. More broadly, he wants to say that many American anarchists and bohemians saw art as the true religion. The, quote, sensuous delights of art and nature replaced organized religion as the vessel of moral and ontological wisdom, end quote. And there was also an aspect of sexual liberation to the movement, which saw Puritan influence in both the worship of money and the restrictive patriarchy, and wanted to do away with both of them. That romantic passion was a form of solidarity and re-enchantment. And then he wants to move on to talking about Emma Goldman, who thought that a centralized industry was, quote, the death knell of liberty, but also of health and beauty, of art and science. That's from 307. He also wants to mention that she was inspired by Nietzsche and managed to adopt some of his elitist attitudes. She was distrustful of the masses and did not escape from the individualistic values of Nietzsche.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have to admit to being like less well versed generally in American anarchism, but I guess I know enough about Goldman to say that that's definitely like a good critique. Like I've read, her work, and it comes through for sure. I feel like the thing that is both the primary point of reference for either people who consider themselves in the Goldman tradition or consider themselves in opposition to it, it's like the same quote, which is the one that Chris already referenced. If I can dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. And it's a silly quote, and part of it I get, right. It's like I want to retain all of that which is beautiful and free in the inner life of a person, right? And on the other hand, the criticism is that this is all you fuckers care about. What about the masses? What about not starving to death?
Yeah, you just definitely see the roots of lifestylist and individualist anarchism, which I think is a toxic poison on the American left. It's just utter fucking trash, and it is part of the reason that we're in the position that we are. And I see the roots of that in Goldman's style of anarchism.
So one other thing I wanted to tag in here on a quote, this is on 308, because we're not just going to talk about the roots of that in Goldman's anarchism, we also need to talk about the roots of this, which are going to also lead to Ayn Rand.
Nice.
Friend of the show, Ayn Rand. So this is McCarraher. He says, thus, although she condemned quote-unquote rugged individualism as a counterfeit of genuine freedom, her own version was at least as atomistic as the competitive anthropology of laissez-faire. Society was a collection of individuals, the social contract fiction of liberal politics from Thomas Hobbes to Margaret Thatcher. And the individual, she declared, was the fountainhead of all values, a cosmos in himself, a grandiosity worthy of Emerson, and soon to be elaborated into a middle-brow theology of money by Ayn Rand, which I thought was some McCarraher fire. And also, I realize that this is something, Don, you and I have talked about that we may probably have to wait to another episode. But I think at some point we do need to discuss the potential assumptions based in sort of bourgeois atomistic individualism that might still be sort of operating in McCarraher's critique. And I shared with you all that we had a really awesome question from one of our listeners that we may not get to today, but we are going to get to it because it really is about the nature of bourgeois individualism and how much that maybe not only colors, sort of Goldman's critique and is also just very amenable to Randian objectivism, but also is maybe operating in McCarraher himself. So anyway, we may not get to that today. It's a big one, but at least that's something that might be relevant here as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, word.
I had some notes on the Bohemian influence getting co-opted and sold as commodities, but I think that's pretty much all I need to say. We can just move on to the arts and crafts movement. So
recuperated.
Yeah, I do think as a kind of a broad comment on both, again, this chapter and the previous one, is I think that the book takes a turn from here about the connection between the radical movements that McCarraher is surveying and the sort of the kind of spiritual, the divine, and it seems fairly tenuous to a point, right? Where it's like, I get that like here he does talk about the sanctuary of art belonging to the anarchist religion, but that's not exactly the same thing as what we've talked about in the previous several iterations of this discussion about like the actual connection between some notion of the cosmos and of God or of some kind of spiritualism and the way in which it manifests in people's lives and how they act upon the world. By the time we get to this like early 20th century radicalism, it's like it's primarily atheistic, and so now suddenly the connection to like any broadly understood conception of religion is like a wordplay more than literal in the way that it is in the first 3 sections of the book. Or at least that's the way it seems to me. And I'm wondering if like for example, in the previous chapter, we mentioned Christian socialism in a sentence, and in this chapter, at least thus far, we haven't gotten to a Christian anarchism, right? So it's kind of like, I don't know, to me these chapters almost feel out of place in the book. I wonder if anybody thinks that.
Yeah, I think before we started recording, I don't know, this section, I think, whether it feels out of place or just, I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm wondering if McCarraher is losing some of his bite, or maybe it's the nature of his political commitments are becoming more sort of fleshed out and coming to the fore, precisely because now we are talking about distinctions between socialism and anarchism. I mean, that was my way of thinking about it.
That's what I thought too.
Just seems like, at least for me, I didn't have as much fun reading this section because I definitely didn't have as much venom in these parts that he did in the first couple sections. Yeah.
So it's often like when it comes to critiquing capitalism, we can agree with the anarchists and the libertarian socialists and the Stalinists even. All across the spectrum, we agree with the critiques of capitalism. But then when we get to the what the fuck to do about it part, and then we all want to kill each other.
Yeah, we should be good enough at our. Never mind. Just God damn it.
McCarraher's still a comrade, even if he's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. You can be comrades with someone, and they can be dumb and wrong on certain things. It's okay.
I wouldn't call McCarraher dumb, but
I know, Chris. I mean, come on. I didn't really mean that.
Yeah.
So,
well, goddamn it! Now I'm gonna have to edit that out.
I just wanted him to know that I don't think he's dumb.
To be fair, though, Jason said something about McCarraher earlier that made it sound like he was saying he was dumb and wrong. So I didn't start that. I'm just repeating what this comrade down here in the bottom left corner of the Zoom.
The only thing I'm going to edit out of this episode is when Jason said that earlier. So it just sounds like Adam starts it.
Just Adam's justifying it based on something that is not in the episode.
Yeah, exactly.
Jason said it earlier, but it's not there. Look, so in both, he does. So, okay, to be more fair to the author here, there is an attempt to return to the question of enchantment and sacralization, and he finds it in both socialism and anarchism in their early 20th century variants, between these two chapters. But they are still so divorced from, again, they're divorced from this blatant and overt spiritualism of all the previous movements that I wonder if I just don't think it lands quite in the same way. Like it maybe what I'm wishing is that he had spelled it out more, that like in the sense that like industrial socialism and industrial anarchism like sees the church and God as being somehow somewhat defeated, right? That the necessity for divinity in a person's life is then reinvigorated and re-injected into the world with the kind of millenarian and in the intangible aspects of the kind of revolutionary philosophy that is embodied in either an Emma Goldman or the Eugene Debs. But he doesn't exactly say that. Like that's kind of my own coloring over these two chapters rather than anything that's quite explicit. And I guess it's another thing that I just kind of feel like it's lacking, and because it's latent, it's in there, but it's not it's not the primary argument, and I feel like that's what connects these to the thesis of the book overall.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so
I'll allow it.
the arts and crafts movement, the other half of this chapter, says that he wants to say that this movement arose from the professional class who's concerned with being eclipsed and irrelevant in the dawning era, and they wanted to revive individual handicraft, artistry, and the enjoyment of crafting, and they sought to re-enchant the world. So that's, kind of, I think, part of what you're talking about, Jason. So the quote from 313, American acolytes inherited from Ruskin, Morris, and English craft writers the modal figures of anti-industrial dissent. The competent and contented artisan, the closely knit village, the fraternal guide, and the handicraft object all enveloped in a religious penumbra. And several craft communities were founded. There's New Clairvaux and Rose Valley. Both eventually folded within the decade, but were communities that practiced handicraft and agriculture. They thought of themselves not only as political and economic vanguards for a new way of living, but also as religious and sacramental spaces for worship.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
Anytime we go to an organic grocer or someplace like a farmer's market and we buy something that is artisanal, is this an attempt to re-enchant the world in a similar way?
So
Why don't you answer your own question?
Yes.
Okay.
I think in a very pale echo, yes. I think for for a let's say in the period in history that this second half of this chapter is investigating, the answer is much more clearly yes, right? That's very obviously the attempt. And if you go to, you spend enough time in a farmer's market, I know it's a joke question, but it's actually, I think it does get at a real serious point.
Hold on, wait a minute. I've made so many jokes, you all don't understand when I'm asking a serious question. I'm asking a serious question.
I never take your
Adam's talking,
seriously.
so I know he's telling a joke.
Jesus. I've brought about my own ruin and destruction. I really do mean this seriously, guys.
Well, then the short version of the answer, since I don't have to do the kind of mental gymnastics to get to a point where we're taking it seriously, then the short answer is yes. Because I think for the small farmer and for the artisan selling their wares, whether they're the weird guy who somehow is a blacksmith and makes money somehow when you makes just like a stall where there's like stuff he made out of leather and then stuff he made out of I guess iron he smelted himself, and that exists alongside like organic tomatoes that actually have a flavor. For those people, that is like a direct connection to something that gives them much more meaning in life, like a considerably less alienated way of performing labor. And so in a sense, that is still a repository of a dying, like close to death, but still, honest attempt of re-enchantment of the world. But I think that when you think about the consumer side of the farmer's market and the way that this is like a lifestyle for people who make a little bit more money because they have white collars instead of blue collars or whatever, and it's very easily lampooned as being like having practically nothing to do with the average person's life. You can see why it is such a pale echo of this this attempt to re-enchant the world, because it is like the rest of the arts and crafts movement and of anarchism and of artisanal radicalism generally, including a whole significant huge part of populism from the previous chapter, is rooted in a dying way of life, which is really only able to sustain itself because it has been able to be recuperated and reabsorbed back into commodity production. So now it's a niche thing to go get organic food when it used to just be called food. We have invented a new category of food that is like special in that it is made the way it's supposed to be made, because that's a small corner of the market rather than all of the food that we eat.
So I was gonna initially say no, but I think no to your question. But I actually think that I agree with everything that Jason said. I just feel like it's so pale. It's pale enough that my answer would just be no. That that there is like a connection there, but I would then label it as like no. This is not re-enchanting the world.
Okay,
So,
since y'all,
but I agree. I mean,
He refuses the dichotomy of yes and no.
he's transcended the need for yes and no. So listen, just so y'all know,
I agree with Jason's answer, but my answer is still no.
that is literally the most Don thing that you could ever do.
It's like I agree with everything. It's just because of all that, I would say no instead of yes.
Well, okay, I do think
I think that's acceptable. Like I see that and I recognize that is a completely logically consistent and not at all at odds with what I said, even if it is a different conclusion.
So, really quick, just to let y'all know, this isn't a real dumb guy shit kind of question. There's a serious thing I want to touch on with this, and I'm going to make this brief. But the same way that we've talked about romantic anti-capitalism being a tendency or a strain that persists as long as capitalism persists, my question is really about, is this also a tendency or a strain that also will persist that is precisely trying to re-enchant the world in a way that isn't even necessarily conscious or is maybe so pale that you could be like, well, it's not actually, that's not what it's about. Very quickly, the thing that I think about and why I ask this question is one of the most unforgettable images that really has always stuck with me. It was a picture of someone in a BMW car dealership, and they were there like getting their vehicle repaired, and the picture was, it was like I think it was like probably like, I don't know, like some like, fairly upper class like woman in her like 30s or 40s or whatever. But while she was waiting for her BMW to get repaired, she had like a legit 19th century like spinning wheel for like spinning yarn. And she was sitting there in the lobby or in the waiting area of the BMW dealership spinning yarn as if she existed in the 19th century while her BMW was getting repaired. And that image always stuck with me because I couldn't help but be like, what is the function of that? Like, what is that doing? And I couldn't help but, reading this chapter, think, is that a very pale and maybe even unconscious sort of connect? Like, that is not really related to production or agricultural production the way you're talking about, Jason. That is something that is completely divorced from that in a lot of ways. So what is it doing? And I just kind of wonder if it's this sort of like bohemian bourgeois like attempt to re-enchant the world in this way.
This raises another really interesting question from me, which is... what were you doing in a BMW dealership?
No, I just saw a picture. I was there and I had some Molotov cocktails. But
they have free coffee in the BMW dealership. You just go in. It's like going into a bank, only the coffee's better.
Yeah, I just go there and lurk and just take notes.
So here's where the yes and the no meet, right? Like, I think McCarraher gives us the language for precisely this phenomenon earlier in the book, which is misenchantment. Because it is an attempt to re-enchant the world in the sense of like reclaiming a simpler way of life, but only in the sense of an affectation. It's like, everybody remembers when the term hipster came back into the popular lexicon, and it was, the image is the guy with the waxed mustache, as if it was 1894, and the big wheel bicycle, and he brews, his own beer at home. Like he's like living a lifestyle that doesn't exist, but that he's also not actually living because he still, works tech support at Apple or whatever. That these are hobbies that a person engages in the same way that you might be in some other variant, an adrenaline junkie, right? Like you go to the safest way that you could possibly experience exhilaration by jumping out of a plane with an instructor and a parachute that has a backup parachute. And, all of that stuff, right? But it's like a way of like injecting a kind of excitement and an adventure in your life that is actually completely phony. But it feels real in the moment, at least enough to like temporarily allay the alienation that comes along with living the actual life that is available to you under the present social order. So it is an attempt, yes. It is absolutely an attempt to re-enchant the world. But Don's right. But Don's right to say no. It's not actually re-enchanting the world. It's only mystifying the reality that you can't do so without fundamentally overturning the basis of social life.
You hear that? Skydiving is reactionary.
It seems like the like a key distinction in the example here is like the initial question was about a person going to the farmer's market and purchasing an apple versus the examples that you gave were the farmer producing an apple or a blacksmith making their own hand-forged, whatever, Mjolnir or whatever. I think that the distinction is between the consumer and the producer. Someone who's disalienated their labor in such a manner that they're able to, in whatever niche market fashion that they can, acting as functionally a small business owner in the present capitalist society, they've been able to disalienate their labor in some small but very real sense. That's a different thing than somebody who purchases and wears the affectation of disalienation produced by others in order to try to alleviate their, whatever, suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make, and it's one that's too easily blurred. It's a legacy of the New Left that the distinction between producer and consumer is sometimes absent, because our understanding of what our actual critique of this society is somewhat distorted by the existence of consumer culture, which is really it is the effect rather than the cause, right? So that the critique of consumer society and of consumer culture is a critique of the excess of the organization of production. And so to get back to the root of what our actual problem with the world is, you can conceivably disalienate your labor by taking control of the full product of your labor, but you can't disalienate your existence by buying really cool stuff. And in either case, can you completely disalienate yourself altogether, because you're still existing in competition with other people and existing to the detriment of the natural world, right? But these are degrees of the human condition as it is degraded, but it starts with production and it ends with consumption. And I just want to point out that there's a marked difference between the first half of this discussion in terms of how we are just absolute morons for 45 minutes, and now we're really actually if we finally finish warming up, which is in a way kind of a note about editing. I would love it to not lose people because of how stupid we are.
This episode is
by way of putting in a request to minimize how my own horrendous miscontributions earlier on in the discussion.
I've escaped the cave a long time ago, and I'm still out here.
Well,
as we say on RL, we out here. R.I.P. Kevin is out here. Don't worry, we're actually going to start this episode an hour and a half in.
And it's no good to be outside of the cave if you're not helping other people get out, though, man. So just sitting out there being quiet, not contributing,
That was Plato's whole fucking point, was that Socrates had to go back into the cave to rescue other people.
Oh yeah, that's real Mahayana Buddhist shit.
Yeah.
It's what does Joe Pesci say to Ray Liotta in Goodfellas when they're sitting around the table? He says, he's content to be a jerk.
I just want to clearly state what just happened there in the span of about 10 seconds. We went from Plato's cave and Socrates to Mahayana Buddhism to Joe Pesci in Goodfellas. I just want to track the movement that happened.
Listen, I will not allow you to restrict my dialectical movements.
Goodfellas, classic movie about guys being dudes.
Yeah,
bros being dudes.
It's really it's the progenitor of the dudes rock thesis.
Yeah.
Oh my god, that just gave me a fucking aneurysm hearing you say that.
That's what I came here to do.
All right. Let's.
Please,
I'm gonna
put us out of our misery.
I'm gonna plow my way through the rest of this chapter real quick. Okay, so we got a few people that he wants to talk about. It's Horace Traubel, who's influenced by Whitman, who is another poet in search of modern enchantment. He says the goal of socialism was justice and equality, yes, but also ecstasy. And art, poetry, and labor eclipse theology as tools of enchantment. Okay, next person. We have Ralph Adams Cram, who's not officially part of the arts and crafts movement, but was opposed to industrial civilization. Quote, this is what McCarraher says about him. He had a theology of reactionary sacramentalism. The roots of capitalism was found in monarchs, lords, and Protestants, and wanted to get rid of basically all of those. Distrusted the masses and democracy and put his hope in businessmen and professionals, and also pushed for strict control on immigration and interracial relationships.
Oh,
so
funny how those are tied together.
Yeah, so
It started out good,
yeah,
getting rid of Protestants and monarchs. I like that, but
yeah.
Which suffers from the similar problem of the other people who started off good, which is Irish Catholic revolutionaries in the North. We want to get rid of Protestants and monarchs, but then they have all these retrograde ideas too.
All right, finishing up criticism on arts and crafts from McCarraher. I'm actually going to skip some of the quotes and just go right to basically his point was that it failed to capture the working class and ended up as a movement for professionals and the new aristocracy.
Like Jacobin.
So, shots fired.
Shots fired at Jacobin.
Yeah, I'm going to put in more cannons from the 1812 overture behind you whenever you said that.
All right,
it's again one of those things I'm going to live to regret saying. So here's my actual commentary on this section. It's just that I think that Walt Whitman's, that little quote in there is one that we should adopt. Maybe not everything about Whitman, but the goal of socialism being something greater than just fulfillment of need, but also like the realization of desire. Right. That's I think it's actually a beautiful sentiment.
Yeah.
Right.
That was Traubel, by the way. Yeah.
Not Whitman.
Not Whitman.
Yeah. So Whitman still gets the wall.
Wait, that wasn't Whitman?
No. That was Horace Traubel.
God damn it.
He was influenced by Whitman, though. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, whatever. Fuck Walt Whitman.
Yeah, so I said Whitman still gets the wall.
All my homies hate Walt Whitman.
Society has progressed past the need for Walt Whitman.
I mean, that's absolutely true. Poetry has gotten a lot better since Whitman. No, it hasn't. It's actually gotten way worse. Just edit all this out. I'm not here.
Let's try to hit this last chapter. Another kingdom of being, critical metaphysical experience, and the search for a passionate vision. I don't know how much I was thinking about just flying through this chapter. So he wants to cover basically 3 other attempts in America to find meaning outside of the corporate economy. So he'll talk about naturalists first, then the pragmatists, and then Anglo-Catholic sacramentalism, which is one person. It's like
the World Workers' Party.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So a couple naturalists he talks about. We have John Burroughs, who thought that the natural divinity included strife and acceptance of social Darwinism. He befriended Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford. Yeah, sounds like a great guy.
Whoops.
Yeah. We have Frank Norris, who thought that nature is both the giver and taker of life and is a force for divine judgment. And then Mary Austin, who lived among Native Americans and Mexicans out in the Southwest and championed that way of life and saw desert living as sacramental. He wants to talk about John Muir as the best-known naturalist and the only one to have influence after World War I. Rejected Christianity with its doctrine of nature and animal life that was valueless to humans, preached a, quote, natural supernaturalism, similar to Emerson and Thoreau. He hated capitalists who sought to destroy natural preserves, but he never condemned capitalist progress and eventually embraced elitism and was basically another bourgeois form of enchantment. I was going to move on to the pragmatists. You guys want to hit anything about the naturalists first before I move on?
No,
okay.
Just the only thing.
Okay.
The only thing I want to say about the naturalists is this chapter is already long compared to considering what it's covering, because this is like such a small footnote compared to socialism and anarchism around the same time.
Also, can I just reference really quick the last chapter in the section that I did, which was on liberal imperialism and eschatology. 12 pages. 12 pages.
Yeah.
This chapter suffers from having taken up all the space that should have been given to that chapter.
Yeah.
And he does seem to make some strange choices about where he allocates his attention.
It might just be like I may have made some pretty strange choices in papers that I've written before, because I'll be like, oh, well, I've got a bunch of books on this subject already. And if I want to write a little bit more on this chapter, I'm going to have to go get some more. So I guess I'll just, write what I can, and I'll pad this other one out, to make up for it in length.
Yeah.
It could. I mean, that's not a serious.
Sure. Yeah.
It's not a serious criticism.
I've made some pretty strange choices too. Like, you might get the false impression that I'm obsessed with Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and I'm really not. I just do find it hilarious.
Yeah. Actually, I thought,
but
Chris,
I never talk about it outside of a conversations with the comrades from the Red Library.
Yeah, on this particular reading series, Chris, I just want to mention, I thought you were going to end that statement with, "I have also made some strange choices," and that was all you were going to say.
Hey, as an editor,
edit it. Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
That's what it needs to say.
you can actually just end there and then let Don finish his notes.
There you go. Yeah.
I know that's what he wishes we would do in real life.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I've noticed the change in Don's voice markedly over the last 30 to 45 minutes.
All right, yeah. So, pragmatists, William James. Sought a passionate vision which could recognize a greater depth or order to the universe. He opposed U.S. imperialism, but did not want to jettison the martial impulse. He just thought that it should be redirected to something constructive. He thought that the obsession with money rendered life banal and cowardly, and poverty was a liberation, and we should live as saints with wonder and vulnerability. Worldly strife stifles these things. And then he has a very brief discussion on Randolph Bourne, who is a critic of pragmatism, who saw most pragmatists, including Dewey, later support World War I. And he said that James, like Dewey, never addressed how new values were created. There's a quote on 345 I was going to read. Pragmatic disappointment indicated that America needed, quote, a new gospel. But the good news remained unclear. Affirming James's poetic vision in Twilight of Idols, Bourne deemed it central to the malcontentedness indispensable to social and political criticism. Yet he could not explain how epiphany or iconoclasm could generate values without ontological warrant. For all his ebullient intelligence, James was nebulous and evasive as Dewey about the origin and creation of values. All right, and then finally, the third grouping that he wants to talk about in this chapter was Anglo-Catholic sacramentalism, but it's really just one person who is Vida Dutton Scudder. It's actually quite a long discussion of Scudder, and I feel like, I don't know how you all felt, but it was probably one of the most positive portrayals that I'd seen in the book of a thinker.
Absolutely.
Scudder wanted to escape the inauthenticity of bourgeois life and began to work in settlement houses with the poor. Eventually believed that socialism, or turned to socialism as the true calling for the Christian, saw that humanity was both a flesh and soul, and so the material and economic are a spiritual concern, but the economic and material forces are also not just dead and automatic processes either. She had reservations about the current state of socialist thinking. This is a quote from 350. Thought that most socialist utopias were, she lamented, dreary, lacking in color, interest, life, painfully dull in their suggestions of enervating material prosperity, end quote. That was the quote from Scudder. McCarraher continues, it says, even the Fabians were, she eventually concluded, bureaucratic and limited. In Socialism and Character, Scudder wondered if, as socialists aimed to supplant love by justice, some of the finest human qualities would atrophy. And she
also what Che Guevara said the same thing.
So Franciscan poverty and Fordist consumerism were she saw as being opposed to one another, basically the either production and consumption versus grace and delight. And she never ended up fully embracing the trust in mechanization that her fellow socialists shared. All right, yeah, I'm going to end my points on that. That way we can cut this episode to a reasonable time.
Just so y'all know, there's like 20 to 30 minutes of us bullshitting at the start of this, and then there's going to be a lot of things to be cut out, so I wouldn't worry about it being too long. So,
well, anyway.
It's too long for Don, though.
It's too long for Don to sit here anymore with us idiots.
No, I'm fine with it. Yeah, I don't mind.
I totally sympathize. If I was having to deal with me, I'd be fucking frustrated as hell.
You're like, I deal with me all the time. It's insufferable.
It's infuriating. So I never heard of Scudder before this chapter, and I don't imagine I'm going to come across this person again. at least like not often in my life. So it's on the one hand, I feel like grateful for having learned a whole lot in this one place, but on the other hand, it's like I do feel like it's a criticism we've made a couple of times already, so it's a very familiar theme. Like there's a lot of space dedicated to this one person, and I guess I just kind of wonder why. It's because I don't think that this person's thought is particularly unique. It just seems to be like I don't even think it's unique in the book. I feel like you've come across other thinkers and other spaces in various movements which are fairly similar. A kind of like a kind of religious socialism in a way.
Okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
She said, like, look right here. I'm going to quote McCarraher here. He says that Scudder repudiated Ruskin's Gothic romanticism after reading the Fabian essays by saying, "Poets and dreamers fed my imagination," she wrote, but in Fabian socialism, she discovered practiced constructive ideas. In Socialism and Character, her most important book, she praised Ruskin's sensitive intelligence, but disavowed his reliance on patrician benevolence and his glorification of craftsmanship. She urged religious socialists to close their volumes of Ruskin and Tolstoy and open up their Engels and open up their Babel. So that's where she differs a little bit. She maintains her commitment to the sacramental socialism, but then also sort of refines it and accepts a more systemic and scientific socialism.
Well, right, and we probably should do all that.
But even still, I mean, Jason's point. Jason's point still remains that that can be said in a page at most.
Right, but
especially relative to the speed with which the book just passes over vastly more significant figures and movements. I think it's more suggestive of. Right, yeah, exactly. But I think it's suggestive, perhaps, of the author's really likes this figure. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think that what I'm gathering about the author is that his politics probably line up with her politics pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was also curious.
Yeah, because
well, just a sort of devil's advocate, and actually ourselves here. I mean, do you think that part of what I'm trying to make Don stop recording? Do you think part of what's also happening here is to some degree, he is trying to reclaim figures precisely that aren't more prominent, to sort of bring out figures or movements or ways of thinking that are lost. I mean, even if we could say, well, okay, there's similarities in all these other people that are much more prominent. Is the point specifically to bring out people who typically get obscured in the historical discussion of these sorts of movements?
I mean, that's kind of what I feel like I was starting to identify with John Spargo and Jack London in the Socialist Party chapter. So, I mean, of course, they get combined about 1/10 of the space that Scudder gets. But I do think that point is well made enough that there does seem to be a few lines per page dedicated, not per page, but several lines per chapter dedicated to people who you might not know anything about, or might not know that they have something to do with this topic otherwise. And so it is probably an overt attempt to elevate some figures in the reader's imagination. This goes a little bit further than that, maybe even a lot further than that. But I guess it's probably because when we think about the criticisms, let's just say that when we think about the analysis that we have had of the kind of unfolding thought of the author, it does seem to be probably best personified in this particular figure of Scudder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We get to go to the Super Bowl?
That should be it. Just cut right there. That's the end of the episode.
There's no telling where you've been.
Do I now? Hey, listen, it don't matter. None of this matters.
It don't matter. None of this matters. I said that to Don and Alex the other day, and Don just looked at me and he just goes, "You need to go to bed right now."
Well, you know what? I need to go to bed right now.
That's a wrap as we cross the threshold, the Rubicon of Eugene McCarraher's Enchantments of Mammon. You know, what I love most about this episode is it has a good balance of real dumb guy shit and real smart guy shit, which is what we are coming to be known for on the Lost Horizons Network. That's our brand. I've even made a meme about it. For part 5, yours truly, Chairman Bain, is going to be back in the driver's seat, and we're going to talk about Fordism and all the other just deeply terrible and horrifying things about capitalist enchantment. So that'll be coming your way very soon. All right, we're out of here for the week. We'll see you back here next week as always, Sunday evening, roughly 7 p.m. Central Time. But until then, comrades, stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated. Try not to be deracinated. Keep searching for lost futures. Keep exploring inner and outer limits of revolutionary political subjectivity. And just know that even on those days when you feel really alone, you feel really isolated and alienated, your comrades here at Red Library, we out here. We always out here. We ain't never going anywhere. Take care of yourselves. Mask on and mask off as appropriate. We'll see you back here next time. Red Library out. Peace.